So as Tim said, it's vital that institutions keep their systems and accreditation up to date, and our next guests are dedicated to just that. They're ensuring testing standards evolve with emerging technologies. They understand how important it is that standards and accreditation work hand in hand. Dr. Ian Opperman is the New South Wales Government's Chief Data Scientist. He's had 30 years' experience in big data, broadband-enabled services, and he steers a number of Standard Australia's technical advisory committees.
Hello, my name is Dr. Ian Opperman. I'm the New South Wales Government's Chief Data Scientist and Industry Professor at the University of Technology, and importantly for today, a Director at Standards Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you very much for joining us to celebrate NATA's 75th anniversary, the National Association of Testing Authorities. It's a really important day, and it's really important that we recognise the role that NATA plays within the Australian economy. Let me begin with standards. And standards, of course, are vital to our modern, digital, connected society. Whether we're dealing with emerging technologies or dealing with issues of critical safety, standards really underpin every aspect of our modern world. Recently, the Commonwealth Government called out the role of critical technologies in Australia's future, whether they be cybersecurity, AI, or quantum computing. Standards play a fundamental role in protecting the public and also creating markets for the future. The important complementary piece to all of the standards work, of course, is conformity assessment or testing, and NATA is the tester of testers. NATA provides government-recognised, internationally recognised accreditation for testers and ensures that all the work that we are doing implementing these standards is actually done appropriately. Again, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today to celebrate NATA's 75th anniversary, and my apologies for not being there in person, but I'm sure it'll be an absolutely fantastic day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. On today's panel, we have Jessie Riddell from Standards Australia, Adam Beck from the Centre for Urban Innovation. Alongside him is Dr. Mark Staples from CSIRO's Data 61 and Professor Lyria Bennett Moses from Allen's Hub for Technology, Law and Innovation. Please welcome today's guests. So, Jessie, starting with you, why are standards and accreditation vital in Australia's transition to a digital future?
Well, as we heard in Dr. Ian Opperman's opening remarks, standards are critical for the modern digitally connected society. And that's the case today, and it's going to be even more so in the future as innovative technologies are being developed in a more and more rapid pace. So how do standards support the digital economy? In short, they're fundamental to driving the development of innovative technologies, innovative products, services and systems. That's particularly the case when they're international standards that are developed by ISO and IEC, the two key international standardization bodies. Those global frameworks that the international standards bodies develop really support the development and the deployment of innovative technologies. In addition to that, and critically, because they develop global standards, these global standards support international interoperability as well as harmonisation, which establishes markets and also reduces barriers to trade. And finally, they also support trust for businesses and consumers in utilising these innovative technologies. So there's a range of benefits that standards bring, but that's only half of the story because to really gain those benefits, the standards need to be backed up by testing and by conformity assessment. And that's where accreditation comes in, testing to testers to make sure that that process and those standards are appropriate and are used and fit for purpose. So yeah, that's really where standards and accreditation are supporting those emerging technologies.
Thank you, Jessie. There's so much to unpack there. We could spend days on this. Adam, you're the former Executive Director of the Smart Cities Council of Australia and New Zealand and the host of the podcast Urbanism.live, which I've been listening to this week. For those who are new to the topic, Could you just go back to basics and define what is a smart city? And do we have any really good examples of them globally or here in Australia?
Indeed, let me start with sort of the real simple definition, which is a smart city is one that uses tech and data to do good. That sounds simple, but there's a lot in that. You've got tech, you've got data, and you've got, what does good look like? So there's an element of, a very simple definition being very different and meaningful for different organisations, different levels of government. Certainly local government, municipalities around the world have been that first wave of sort of smart cities adopters. They've been trying to find all different types of technology and data solutions that can help them do their job better. They're in the business of taking public money and delivering great infrastructure and great services. But at a local government level, it's very hard as well. In Australia, local government takes in about 3.6 to 3.8% of all sort of taxable revenue. So it's a hard game. And so being smart is kind of, the only option now. In terms of what it looks like on the ground, it looks very different. If I just sort of pick New South Wales for a moment, head up to Lake Macquarie, some of the most advanced uses of sensors and cameras for reducing deaths in rips on beaches. If we head west, we see multiple ways in which environmental sensing is helping protect water quality. We're seeing main streets and high streets recover from the COVID pandemic and the economic impact by monitoring urban life and vibrancy through pedestrian counting. We're seeing local government use transparency, the use of data, to actually drive a greater relationship with their community by opening the books and seeing where their money is spent. So it is very diverse, and every morning when we wake up, I sort of describe it as being a world in which there's another 3,000 solutions that we have on offer. So a very simple idea, tech and data for good, but the supply side is not slowing down at all. So like all good transformation agendas, you need a clear strategy. It's got to make sense for you. Tech and data doesn't solve the world and its problems, but gee, it can have a powerful impact. Just look at what happened with QR codes during the pandemic. So it can look very simplistic and beautiful in some ways. There can be very overcomplicated sort of solutions and approaches as well, but we're all learning. It's been a 10, 12, 15-year journey. Australia, I think, is very much punching above its weight. When I started in this game about 6 years ago, I could count the number of local authorities in Australia who were kind of embracing it with a bit of a strategy and some resourcing and piloting. I could count it on two hands. There's a good 180 now in sort of, my monitoring sort of list. So we're certainly looking more and more each day at how tech and data can help deliver better services and infrastructure.
And globally, do you think there are any role models that Australia could learn from?
Oh, look, certainly I don't like to have favourites, but I will. But Barcelona is one that continues to just take a next step. They very much have looked at technology and data as a core part of their city building practices, the way they engage with their community, how they treat data as well. Treating data as a valuable city asset, not just roads and steel and concrete and infrastructure, those physical things, but data is a really valuable asset to the community. So I love what Barcelona has done. We see a number of countries over in the sort of Nordic regions as well. The US, I lived there for 3 years. Fantastic work being done in not just big, high-profile New York City kind of cities, but cities that we've never heard of before that are using, particularly through the power of partnerships and joint funding and financing, getting basic things like digital connectivity. Portland, Oregon is another one that uses social justice and equity and inclusion as a driver for their smart cities projects. So, it was very easy to pick, a couple of favourites about 5-6 years ago. It's very prolific now. And what's nice is for those that are just entering the journey of smart cities now, there's so much to draw on in terms of use cases and case studies. And indeed, of course, standards are now starting to emerge, which put us on the same page, common understanding, allow us to scale. That's been one of our challenges to date, which is a lack of standards. They're coming through the pipeline now. It's going to allow us to scale, replicate and have big impact in a positive way.
So the standards almost give us a common language between the cities.
Absolutely. The Smart Cities agenda was standardless for a good sort of 5 to 10 years. It wasn't really until BSI in 2014 really published one of those first, what I'd call strategic standards that just defined what smart cities was. And we could all go, oh, okay, I kind of get it now. And of course, you know, private enterprise can move on, government can create policy. So it's coming close to a decade where we started to see the first standards coming through. But, you know, last night, 10 p.m. till midnight, I was on the line with ISO IEC on a digital twin review committee, you know, call, as we're all doing now, volunteering our time because, you know, we want to make the best of this opportunity. So, yeah, the standards are coming thick and thin, which is good. We've got a lot more work, I think, to do around certification and accreditation, but we need the standards to start with, and we're certainly in a better place than what we were a few years ago.
Thank you. And Dr. Mark Staples, you're the co-author of the book Architecture for Blockchain Applications. Sounds like light bedtime reading. Yeah. How does blockchain fit into the smart city model that Adam has been describing?
Yeah, so blockchain is one of the technologies you can imagine using to implement some of the digital infrastructure that can support smart cities. And so when blockchain is working, it's kind of invisible digital infrastructure, and what it does is it helps us share data, and it helps us share programs or behaviour, digital behaviour, between multiple different organisations and people. And it does that without any sort of single business or organisation having control of the infrastructure. So it's a collective that comes together to operate this shared infrastructure. And so what blockchain gives us in terms of what it's good for, it gives us new ways to work together, sharing data and programs without relying on this sort of central trusted authority. And it also gives us new ways of representing and controlling, giving us exclusive control for digital assets and for authoritative processes on the blockchain. So all of that is what you would want to have in a smart city context, which is very complex and dynamic. There's lots of services, there's often lots of levels of jurisdiction, lots of organisations, different kinds of resources, and you need to combine data and integrate data across all of that within a smart city context. And that's some of what blockchain might be able to help with.
So, look, my limited understanding of blockchain technology is that it's already inherently secure, transparent, traceable. So how does accreditation add to that value?
Yeah, I think when we say secure, so classical idea of security is we have the so-called CSIRO properties, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And blockchain's really good about supporting data integrity, that's its main thing, but it's not very good for confidentiality. And because the way blockchain operates and the way we get data integrity is through high levels of transparency. So among the collective that's operating the blockchain, they're all cross-checking each other's work constantly, and that's what gives us integrity, but it's also what makes it hard to achieve confidentiality or privacy. So although the blockchain itself has high data integrity for the data that's on-chain, what's critical is that we still need to get good quality data onto the blockchain in the first place. And that's where we need, high-quality processes and accreditation for the sources of data and for how we add data onto the blockchain. So I think that's in a sense how accreditation can improve blockchain. I think maybe I'll also say there's a kind of another opportunity looking at the other direction, which is how can blockchain help accreditation? And I think because with accreditation, certification, product information, all of that is information coming from many different parties. It's hard to know who would be a single controller for helping to integrate all of that information. And so that's another way, I think, in which blockchain might be able to help in this accreditation ecosystem as well, as providing infrastructure to integrate all of that kind of information.
Thank you. So if I could bring Lyria in here. Hello, Lyria. You're also the co-author of a book, Artificial Intelligence, Robots and the Law. And I'm wondering, what are some of the biggest challenges that regulators and lawmakers are facing with the increasing role that AI is playing in our everyday lives?
Thank you. So I think the first big thing really in that question is, what do we even mean by artificial intelligence? Because the word gets used, or the phrase gets used, to describe many different things. So just from a starting place, I think standards has been really helpful in sort of defining both that term and some of the subcategories. And then when you look at issues, some of them are issues that are sort of for that whole universe of AI, and others are more in specific contexts, which again, particular kinds of AI raise particular issues that others might not. If I sort of think of the three main sort of headline issues that really cut across most kinds of AI, one would be the challenge of accountability. So there are varying levels of automation in AI, and this is obviously more of a problem the more you sort of hand over power to a system. But how do you essentially avoid the kind of computer says no problem? How do you ensure that organisations, individuals remain accountable for the ultimate end game, a decision, a process, an action, when part of it is being delegated to what might not be a completely transparent system? And I use the term accountability, though, as the primary one rather than transparency, because the kind of transparency you require, or for that matter, the kind of explainability you require, is ultimately linked to the accountability needs of the system. A way to explain that would be that if I'm driving an automated vehicle, I don't need to know in technical detail why it slowed down at this point rather than at that point. I want to make sure I know simply that it has been evaluated and tested, and that in all sorts of different road conditions that it meets the requirements. I don't need that level of technical breakdown, so I don't need that kind of an explanation. I do need to make sure that that the system as a whole remains accountable. In other words, in that context, when I buy a car, I know testing and evaluation has been done. If we're talking about a different kind of context, accountability might require understanding how the system actually works. So whether you need explainability, whether you need transparency, in my mind, hinges on the accountability needs of the particular system. A second set of challenges, which really arises from the link between AI and the fact that this is ultimately data-driven decision-making. So you've got large data sets that are being analysed by systems yielding some kind of result, is what often gets called the challenge of bias, which is really about what kinds of distinctions is it okay to make and what kinds of distinctions isn't it okay to make? And that's a really hard and challenging problem. I think someone's worked out there are over 30 different ways to measure fairness. So it's really a question of, again, providing that vocabulary to understand it and to explain what kinds of testing can be done against different kinds of fairness metrics. So which fairness metric for which system, and then what testing can be done to ensure you're meeting it, what changes you need to do, and how do you ensure that you can meet those kinds of metrics. So that's sort of the second set of challenges. And the third really comes back to a similar sort of thing, perhaps with blockchain, which is the data universe, if you like. So how do you ensure the integrity of data going into these systems? How do you ensure data privacy and so forth, which I imagine is not just an AI problem, but really cuts across many.
So I saw you in a UNSW webinar talking about the challenges of, say, facial recognition software, which is really useful, very handy, but also could be harmful to people in countries where the government record or photograph, people who are protesting and then use that evidence against them. Is there a way that accreditation or standards could safeguard against some of those biases?
I think it's got to be a combination. So if you're talking about something like red lines, then ultimately a lot of the time you actually do need cold hard law in there that might prohibit, for example, Australian law enforcement agencies, recording everybody and face identifying everybody at protests or whatever, either because they're just not going to do that anyway, or you might need to put in something in particular into the powers that they're given. But standards can play a really important role in a lot of the problems that are encountered with facial facial recognition technologies. So a really good example is one of the challenges in facial recognition is that it is differentially accurate. So it is, I think, best on white men, and depending on where else you sit, it has higher error rates. Now that becomes a bigger problem in some kinds of systems than others. One sort of very well-known example is that people from certain racial backgrounds were not able to use the automated passport photo recognition system when they applied for their passports. It doesn't work on them that it might work on other populations. Now that is something that standards can fix. That's not a sort of red line, we need laws, and in fact laws wouldn't be effective. They're not terribly adaptable. That is something where you can actually have a standard to say, this is the requirements of these kinds of systems for this kind of application. This is the kind of testing that can be done for some of the known problems. And before they're used in particular in really sensitive settings, accreditation.
There's a lot to unpack there. So as we heard, this is a question for all of you really, as we heard earlier from NATA's CEO Jennifer Evans, that accreditation can often be more flexible and agile than regulation. Do you see a role where standards and accreditation could be helpful in ensuring that these technologies are fit for purpose and free maybe of some of the biases that critics are worried about? Does anyone want to answer that?
I think standards can have impacts in lots of ways. Sometimes it's just by giving us a common language to talk about, and so the smart cities example was mentioned before, but that's also true in blockchain, which is still a kind of very early stage technology, and a lot of the standards there are just providing us a language to talk about this technology. The standards then can give pointers or guidance around best practice, and then sometimes they're also adopted into regulation as well. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's depending on the standard, the kind of standard it is, and depending on the kind of use or criticality of the system you're developing. And I think Lyria mentioned, I think that sometimes regulation is more or less useful in trying to control some of these things as well.
Yeah, and maybe to sort of give an example of the different roles that each can play. So I think we can all agree that, discrimination, just to go back to that bias example, discrimination law is required at a legal level to say these things are not okay. You can't discriminate against these kinds of groups. But when you're looking at something like moving from a human decision maker motivated by animus towards some particular group to a system, you actually need a lot more guidance than, don't be racist, don't be sexist, because what does that mean in the context of the use of particular systems? So in that kind of a context, what standards can do is provide the common language. It can explain different categories of bias, what they mean, why particular ones might be problematic and other ones perhaps less so, but can then sort of take that next step to help organisations build systems that not just the don't be racist, but what kinds of testing can you do to ensure your system is treating everybody fairly within the context of its operation? And the level of detail, and often very technical detail, complete with evaluation frameworks and so forth, you need to do that well. If you put it into law today, it'll be obsolete very quickly. If you put it into standards, both at a high level and moving down levels, you both have better technical expertise into the process of creating them, but you will often also be able to word that in ways that allow organisations to innovate and do it even better as well.
So this is the opportunity now, if you've got the Slido app, to put in a question. I've got the Slido app open, so if you'd like to ask our panel any questions, now's your opportunity. While we're waiting for questions, Jessie, what does the future look like for certification in emerging technologies as far as standards and accreditation goes?
That's a great question, and I think as we've been discussing the sea change in how regulation is looked at in terms of new and emerging technologies, the pace which new and emerging technologies are being developed, and I guess a growing view that standards and accreditation can be a more agile and flexible way to look at some of the issues there. There's also been a sea change in how we have to look at standards development due to the pace of change and the pace of development of these new technologies. Really to keep up with that pace of change, standardisation needs to be more agile and move quicker So that's definitely key, and it's the same for accreditation. So yeah, that's certainly something that is an ongoing issue and is something that is being worked on in the international level and national level.
We've got a question here, anonymous questioner, and I think this one is for you, Mark. So much has been recently reported about cryptocurrencies. Are standards and accreditation managing the uncertainty in Bitcoin, for example?
Yeah.
Sounds like someone's got some investments there they want checked.
Bitcoin was, I guess, the first system to kind of use a blockchain in its implementation, and but these days, blockchain is used in many other public blockchains that have other kinds of cryptocurrencies, but it is also used in many other settings. And so different forms of blockchain are used without, for example, the expensive electricity sort of requirements that Bitcoin has in its proof of work mechanisms. And so some of them are just becoming more kind of enterprise technologies. In terms of standards for cryptocurrency, there is work. Some of it's, like, in a sense, creating sort of technical reports or other kinds of guidance in relation to either the technology used for cryptocurrencies or for how the functionality of, for example, digital currency. What should that be? How should that work from a sort of technical functionality perspective? But ultimately, I think a lot of the controls in this space come from regulation.
I think this one is also for you, Mark. Someone asks, how can accountability in healthcare be enforced through accreditation while using... Oh no, this is for you, Lyria, sorry. How can accountability in healthcare be enforced through accreditation while using AI technology for medical testing? Or how can blockchain aid in this as well? It's a question for both of you.
So I think if you're thinking about, how do you ensure that, a system operating in the context of healthcare, how do you ensure accountability of the sort of human-machine healthcare delivery as a whole? There actually are sort of very high-level standards being developed in AI, so an AI management system standard, for example, which really talks about the different kinds of considerations that the top-level management and so forth need to factor in when building a system. It will go through all the different kinds of controls. So there's not a sort of short and simple answer to that. But once that system is developed, what organisations will be able to do is, if you like, go through the controls, decide which ones are appropriate. There might be some that are sort of more relevant in the healthcare context. I'm thinking, for example, a lot of the controls around data privacy would be particularly important in that context, as well as taking into account some of the sort of risks and how the organisation manages those, and so forth, as well as other more general things. And then through going through that process, and it would be possible to get certified against that standard, being able to say, yes, we actually have put together good management around our use of, the question is asked sort of what specifically it's been used for, but the use of this system in this context. And we've chosen the controls that are appropriate to that, and then where we have a way of tracking through that we are meeting those.
So it's a continual work in progress in many ways.
Absolutely, and as I said, there's the high-level sort of standards, and then there's the potential over time to create maybe sector-specific guidance as well. But at the moment, as I said, the main work is on that sort of high-level cross-industry standard.
Thank you. I think this question might be from a NATA person. With increasing adoption of technologies such as blockchain, how will NATA assess the accuracy and robustness of the application in a particular facility?
Yeah. So in our research work in CSIRO in this space, our group is always thinking about the role of blockchain as a component in a system. And so the system is never the blockchain entirely itself. It's just a kind of one of the pieces in a broader system. And the broader system is what's used in a particular setting in an application environment. And so you could, if we asked the question, but instead of the word blockchain, we had database put in there instead, how would NATA go about assessing, the use of a database in the context of a system in a particular setting? I think that's the answer for blockchain is the same for that, is you're not necessarily kind of assessing the database or the blockchain by itself. You're assessing this system and the use of the system in a context.
Thank you. Another question that's just come through. What does all of this mean for Industry 4.0?
Is that a smart cities question?
Yeah, I mean, Industry 4.0, smart cities, innovative, industry. There's a lot of terms that I think are in the same neighbourhood together. We're seeing digital and data enable and transform all different types of sectors, and Industry 4.0 is this phase we're moving into. It's also another important term, of course, and we have a national strategy around this, which is a digital economy. So there's no shortage of sort of indications that we're becoming more digitalised. I think what is interesting, going back to that point around how swiftly it's evolving and the role of standards and accreditation, is that I think transparency and trust is what is going to allow things to thrive going forward. Many of us want to live a Netflix lifestyle, when I want, how I want it, and I want 4 other recommendations immediately. And so we make a lot of decisions on the fly. We push accept, we push buy, and we just assume that everything's going to work. And I think standards and accreditation, we haven't even seen yet the reliance that we're going to have on that to allow us to live that, real-time, near real-time kind of lifestyle that many of us are wanting. I've got 2 teenage daughters, and they're clicking any button that comes up, and they want it now. If the Wi-Fi's down for 45 seconds and I'm interstate, I get the text message. Like, we have a generation coming that are just digital natives, and it is in real time, on demand, and that is not going to work without transparency or trust. That's going to be the currency of our future cities, transparency and trust.
So is maybe the message for us, if we want to be living in smart cities, we need to be smarter. We need to be more discerning also. I mean, we need to feed back to standards about what sort of standards we want.
Yeah, and herein lies sort of the irony at times, a lot of focus on the technology and the data, but it's humans that write the standards, it's humans that write the policy, it's humans that decide to act or not based on what the data and the insights say. So it's a very human agenda, ironically, as well. And many of us are it's like any other transformation agenda: workplace health and safety, quality assurance. One way we were doing it this way, the next day we're being told to do it another way. It takes a lot of capacity building, awareness raising. We have to go through all that again. So we've been here before. We will stumble, we will make mistakes, we're going to have challenges, there'll be court cases, there'll be controversy. This sort of change, Industry 4.0, it's happening pretty swiftly, but I'm finding the world is becoming a smaller place. We're learning from each other, we're sharing more, we're actually sharing more, which is a beautiful thing. So it's kind of becoming more human as well. And I think, just the community of volunteers, for example, with NADA and others, and Standards Australia, is a demonstration that we all want a better place, a better planet, a better economy. We want to be more sort of prosperous and well. So it's a world where it's becoming more digital, but it's becoming more human as well. And that's a bit of a head spin at times to reconcile that. I think when it gets too out of balance, we should be worried, but I'm not worried yet.
Not yet, that's good. Anyone else, as we wrap up, would anyone else like to add something? Thank you, Mark.
I think a lot of us are talking about issues related to trust. If for AI, trusting that, or smart cities, or for blockchain as well, it's often talked about as a trust technology. And trust is when we're kind of accepting dependence on someone else. So if I trust something or someone, I'm accepting that I'm exposed to risk from that person or thing. And so that's, I think, what's critical when we're trusting so much more digitally and in the economy. And so what's critical is that when we are trusting something, that we're trusting something that's trustworthy. And that's what I think accreditation is critical for assuring.
That's a very nice place to end. Thank you, Mark. And thank you to Jessie Riddell, Professor Lyria, Bennett Moses, Adam Beck, and Dr. Mark Staples for that thought-provoking discussion. It really was just the tip of the iceberg. But that brings us to a close for our live webinar. And we hope that these case studies have given you some food for thought on how accreditation affects your daily lives and why it's so important. On behalf of NATA, thank you to everyone for registering and watching. We look forward to showcasing more accreditation stories soon. Until then, you can follow NATA on socials or visit nata.com and sign up for NATA News, nata.com.au, I should say. And thank you very much.